Hello, welcome to my review of White Noise by Don Delillo, which was published in 1985 in the UK and 1984 in the US. As usual, this review should not be considered spoiler-free. The plot follows Jack Gladney, a professor of Hitler studies at a small American town. The book is split into three, and the first third introduces us to Gladney's family, focuses a great deal on the bizarre people that make up his university and the various useless courses that they teach. It also shows us a little bit about life in the small town where he lives. And throughout the whole thing, Gladney obsesses about death. In the second section there's a chemical spill that causes the town to be evacuated while Gladney obsesses about death. And in the third, Gladney discovers that his wife Babette has been cheating on him in order to secure a medication called Dilar that is supposed to help cure the fear of death. Gladney then obsesses about Dilar because it will cure his obsession about death. Now, if that sounds a little bit thin on story for a novel that runs to 330 pages, that's not all down to my attempts to avoid spoilers. White Noise is a novel about a lot of things, but none of them is a tight, dense or intricate plot. Death certainly features, useless academia is a big theme, and a modern life that's full of screens and excessive consumerism is another. When Gladney discusses television with some of his university colleagues, Murray Siskin sums up the novel's attitude. A forest fire on TV is on a lower plane than a 10-second spot for automatic dishwasher all. The commercial has deeper waves, deeper emanations. Delillo's past career in advertising explains in part why this theme recurs over and over in the text. The TV seems to be the only source of information in the Gladney's house. The various children and adults all offer factoids and information that, divorced from context, is either wrong or useless. The TV knows all, yet according to Alphonse, one of the professors, the flow is constant. Words, pictures, numbers, facts, graphics, statistics, specs, waves, particles, motes. Only a catastrophe gets our attention. The television provides the codes that make us unique as a species, according to Gladney, who recommends one of his sons to Siskin as a useful study because he has grown up in the Australian outback without a television. Though he can read and write, Gladney clearly considers the lack of a TV will make him something of a regression. During the airborne toxic event that occurs in the second section of White Noise, the Gladney family mostly ignore the event until the last minute when the disaster goes through a handful of naming iterations before it's given a suitable, consumption-friendly, nondescript name. The evacuation is made compulsory, and here we see even the authorities relaying information using soundbites that come perilously close to reducing their orders to a repeated advertisement-style slogan. The incongruity of this annoys the Gladney children, who presumably prefer their TV on the TV and not outside the window. I found the stop-start nature of the evacuation to also mirror a kind of TV coverage interrupted by ad breaks. It was interesting at best though, because Delillo doesn't seem to want to focus on the disaster as much as springboard off it to explore any one of his major themes. Amongst it all, Gladney seeks out Murray Siskin for a chat. Siskin seems like an author insert with added weirdness, and for all his pseudo-intellectual offerings, I didn't find him amusing, interesting or convincing. Whenever he appeared in the book, in fact, it seemed to switch into neutral and at best drift along. Gladney's discussion of how he renamed his son Heinrich, like the renaming of the airborne toxic event, seems rather like an advertising board meeting. The emphasis on a name that can be associated with strength suggests that Gladney sees his son as a product, as does his own use of an invented name and persona for teaching his course in Hitler studies. As part of a debate on the modern focus on the superficial and the intrusive nature of technology and advertising, a consumer culture out of control, White Noise feels very modern. The passage on your screen certainly seems like something you may well have heard on the internet lately. Delillo is himself a college dropout, and he describes his brief experience of academia as a waste of time. The academic world he depicts is one of squabbling man-children arguing about movie trivia and teaching courses of no practical use in the outside world. Gladney's best friend Murray Siskin, for example, teaches courses on Elvis and movie car crashes. It's certainly ironic, given Delillo's scorn for academia, that this book regularly appears on university reading lists and has inspired so much critical writing. The downside to mass market education is, of course, that mass market is often translated as lowest common denominator, as shown by Siskin's courses of very dubious educational value. Again, this is a debate that's still ongoing. Gladney's course on Hitler studies is interesting in that rather than look into the war and the horrors of the Holocaust or Shoah, it instead focuses on the Nazi paraphernalia, the rallies, the uniforms, and the iconography. that surface spectacle that was almost used to make Hitler himself a commodity, if you like, not just to the Germans in the 30s and 40s, but to millions of people around the world through the more modern apparatus of the History Channel. As Gladney observes in the book, we couldn't have TV without him. That the course effectively ignores the mass murders committed by the Nazis is, in part, due to Gladney's obsession with death. Whether it's the general buzz of traffic from a highway or the pervasive hum of electronic appliances or the disconnected sound bites that the TV and radio interject into various conversations, the white noise of the title is ubiquitous through the text. This example and its heavy-handed, deathly imagery comes from Gladney's icebox. A humid spell of weather, I opened the refrigerator, peered into the freezer compartment. A strange cracking sound came off the plastic food wrap, the snug covering for half-eaten things, the Ziploc sacks of liver and ribs, all gleaming with sleety crystals. A cold, dry sizzle, a sound like some element breaking down, resolving itself into freon vapours. An eerie static, insistent but near subliminal, that made me think of wintering souls, some form of dormant life approaching the threshold of perception. Very early on, Gladney likens the ever-present drone of static to the babbling of dead souls. There was an expressway beyond the backyard now, well below us, and at night, as we settle into our brass bed, the sparse traffic washes past, a remote and steady murmur around our sleep, as of dead souls babbling at the edge of a dream. The linking of machinery to man, the anthropomorphism of the product life cycle, represents itself in the permanent hum of artificial life, the babbling of souls amidst the rampant consumerism, commodities failing to perform their intended functions, Gladney's periodic frenzied attempts to rid himself of these dead products, and the post-mortem he performs on his own garbage in an attempt to find the missing drugs that will release him from his paralysing phobia of death, but in the end only exacerbates it. The white noise, whether it truly represents the babbling of dead souls or not, permeates the book and is more strongly linked with television than anywhere. TV and death in the afterlife are linked again by the constant repetition of the murder of JFK and Hitler's more or less constant presence. TV, then, is faking a kind of life after death, which in part is why Wilder reacts so unhappily to Babette's appearance on the local show. But it's clear that any afterlife proposed by the television is very much in question because TV throughout is a confused jumble, obfuscating rather than enlightening. The only place Gladney finds any peace from the constant buzz is actually at the graveyard. I was beyond the traffic noise, the intermittent stir of the factories across the river, so at least in this they'd been correct, placing the graveyard here, a silence that had stood its ground. But are these souls at peace? Have they drifted away now that even their own gravestones have crumbled and died, erasing their names and existence? Away from the intrusions, the background noise and the distractions that the others are now part of, are the babbling souls of the white noise, like Jacob Marley, doomed to rattle around the very thing that distracted them from the true answers that those buried in the graveyard have found in their faith. It's a nice idea, especially if you're religious, but I think it's a quite hard case to prove in this novel, especially given the reaction of the German nuns of Iron City towards religion. Mostly, white noise rather skirts around answers, and I think it takes the worst kind of the postmodern approach, which is rather a everything you know is wrong, so fuck you approach. For a novel that handles the exploration of death in a far more entertaining way, with a less belligerent approach, try Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Delillo writes strong, probing prose with occasional examples of a very dry humour, and the first passage that sort of drew me into the book was on page 32 when Gladney describes the ailing Howard Dunlop as his complexion was of a tone I want to call flesh-coloured. Earlier in the text we also get this look at the Gladney sex life. This back and forth continues for a couple of pages, and while it mirrors the sex act in a literary way, it is as close as Jack and Babette get to intimacy that evening. It's one of a number of ways in which Delillo represents and comments on a dysfunctional family life. The commentary is not always as successful as this, though. Both Jack and Babette have been married before, and their several children all come from previous relationships. As a satire, this has rather been defeated by time, and I suspect few people won't know or come from a very similar family themselves. The scattered nature of the family, with other children and partners living abroad, presents something of a family diaspora, or the international globalization of the most intimate of the family group. Yet other than the dated commentary it offers, it's all rather pointless, with none of the children developed enough to see much in the way of consequences, such as a pronounced sibling rivalry, jealousy or distress, or even much consideration that their situation is unusual. The children are all varying degrees of odd, but all slightly less so than the adults around them. It's fairly interesting that Gladney never really describes his family in one place, and with various people introduced, others arriving fleetingly and leaving as the story goes along, there is this piecing out of the details that kind of fractures the family as the novel progresses. It's an interesting style, but like everything else, is not really put to a very striking use. Ultimately, what determines for most people whether you'll enjoy a text or not doesn't come down to the way it discusses weighty themes or their ongoing relevance to the world even 30, 40 years later. Is whether it's actually enjoyable or not, and White Noise feels much longer than its 330 pages. Gladney's fixation on death makes it repetitive and, in places, laborious to anyone that doesn't share that obsession, which I hope is most of us. If not, then I think self-help books and or religion are probably more useful to casual readers than White Noise is. The plot, such as it is not very interesting, and despite occasional wry or quirky humour, nor are any of the characters. As early as page 7 I realised that this book was probably not for me, that nothing much would happen in it and that nobody was really going to grow or change very much. White Noise is the equivalent of a 330-page holding pattern then, and I really found it hard to read for longer than shortish 20 to 30-minute sessions before something more interesting like the rate of grass growth would distract me. Beyond eliciting a rare chuckle or two, it didn't significantly move me to any emotion other than boredom. Some of what White Noise has to say is about subjects that remain relevant to a lot of discussions that are still happening today, not just in literature but in our newspapers and occasionally in parliaments. In other places, time has caught up with the commentary. For example, the family unit he depicts probably isn't particularly out of place in the modern era. The crushing weight of information overload has been revolutionised by the internet, but the local town rumour mill with its excessive misinformation and contradictory stories will be familiar to anyone with a Twitter or Facebook feed. Despite the absence of mobile phones, it still feels pretty modern, helped in part by Delillo's elegant prose and those jokes that land. Where the text fails for me is there isn't a single depiction of a human that is convincing, and the laborious story does nothing and goes nowhere, making for text that is more used to those battling insomnia than those looking for any great insight into the modern world. For a more serious and more modern take on the same kind of themes, I'd recommend Dave Eggers' The Circle, while Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho and Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club show that you can make a humorous critique of the world around you and still have a plot and characters that engage. Tom Sharpe's Wilt series handles a similarly useless academic protagonist in a more effective way as well. Occasionally, I like to remind viewers that I read every book that's recommended to me, though I prefer recommendations that don't come from spite. Your motivations are your business. Recently I've added the disclaimer that I won't read any more Bella Forrest or Sarah J. Maas, but feel free to recommend anything else to me via YouTube or on Twitter at Seagulls Gather, that's all one word. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.